off with city manager.
I think I'm going to turn it right over to Finance Director Russ Van Gompel. You have the agenda in the folder, or the electronic folder, as it were, to just go over some basics of our capital improvement program. And really, the focus is going to be on debt tonight. That's because it's such a large function of what we do. However, this was not intended to be a description of all the capital improvements. That's really not the purpose of this. However, given the fact that the bulk of the capital improvements program is infrastructure, Mr. Robbie is here, and given the fact that one of the priority goals that council gave me was facilities, I have Mr. Fitzpatrick here regarding facilities. So we kind of covered the two largest bases. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Russ to make a brief presentation.
Okay, so council members should have received a digital copy of the actual recommended CIP, capital improvement plan. It's a 5-year plan, and I'm just going to walk through some points about the plan itself, and if you have questions, jump in. And then we'll talk about debt, and we'll talk about some of the other things that are facing the city as we move forward. But traditionally, we have done a 5-year capital improvement plan. And what you have this evening is that traditional 5-year capital improvement plan. But in working with James and some of the transportation needs, we actually are going out, at least with the public works projects, 10 years. In the past, they used to back end load year 5 with all the future stuff. But with some of the transportation funding options that are available to the city, if we go out and plan for 10 years, we can start getting in line for funding on some of those longer range projects. James, did you want to just touch on that just a little bit?
Yeah, one of the funding programs for street reconstruction projects is the STP Urban program. It uses federal CDBG dollars distributed to the state, and then the state distributes those monies amongst the metropolitan planning organizations. Here in Oshkosh, our Oshkosh area MPO historically has been just Winnebago County and the city of Oshkosh submitting projects. Recently, the town of Algoma did submit a project, and the Amro Road project is under construction right now utilizing STP urban monies. Winnebago County has the next project, which is scheduled for 2024. And about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was informed by East Central Wisconsin RPC and the DOT that the next stage of the STP projects, which would be about 2026, 2027 construction, is due for submittals this year. And one of the requirements of the STP program is that the project be in your long-range capital plan. Or in some sort of long-range planning document. So as I was working through that with Russ and Mark, I asked them, look, can we publish the 10-year street program in particular, streets, utilities, and all of that, because that'll really set us up, instead of having to overload year 5 of the CIP like we historically had done. We'll have that 10-year plan, so then as not only the STP, but we've all heard a lot of stories about a federal infrastructure package coming out, and I would expect very similar requirements of, is the project you're submitting in your long-range capital plan? So I want us to publish that 10-year plan so that as monies may become available, we can say, yeah, here's my 10-year plan. I'm just picking this project and picking stuff out of the queue and submitting it.
So we've presenting, and we have titled a 5-year plan, but we will add a supplemental or appendix to the plan when we present it in August, which will include those projects for 2027 and going on another 5 years. So just to keep that in mind. So the schedules we have tonight, I just going out 5 years and presenting you 5 years, but we've started to extend this into more of a 10-year.
I think one thing too, Russ, it's important to note, we've already been doing this 10-year estimate on the utility side to help Ellers with our long-range utility rate analysis. So it's really just incorporating more of the street portions of that. So we had about half of the work done already. So it's just kind of expanding it a little bit more to be a little more comprehensive.
That change, with other departments, we'll be working on that for next year. We just did not do that with the other departments because we kind of phasing that in. So the actual plan itself starts out with the policy, and the policy went through long-range finance and city council. That has not changed. So you have a copy of the basically the CIP policy, which talks about all the different definitions and ranking and those type of things, and we'll cover that. But the plan itself, the last couple of years, we've started out by having a summary by department, and we summarize the departments from facilities, maintenance, police, fire, public works, streets, central garage, sanitation, recycling, parks, forestry, cemetery, planning, traffic, the Grand Opera House, TIF projects, convention center, library, museum, parking, utility, transit, water, sewer, stormwater, parkland improvements. So we have a summary for you within each of the departments. Then the next section is actually a summary based on funding source. And that's probably the one that I think we're going to try to focus on tonight. We have different funding sources. We still have special assessments. I know there's been some debate on that. We have utility debt, and most recently the city has financed all of its utility debt with what's called revenue bonds, and I'll talk about the different bonds and notes just to give you a refresher in just a few minutes. We also use current operating funds, utility funds for projects. So basically the current user fee is sufficient to cover some capital needs in the utilities. General obligation debt is backed by the tax ability of the city, and that's in the form of bonds and notes. Bonds have to go out 20 years, notes are usually 10 years or less. We do have a project that's identified for the state trust fund loan, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but basically our refuse trucks, we're looking at using the state trust fund loan because we don't even get 10 years of life out of refuse trucks. They get beat up pretty bad and their lifespan is a lot shorter than 10 years. We'll be looking at some safe drinking water loan, a state loan program to help finance like the Clearwell project. So that's a funding source as well. We do try to fund some capital projects with levy dollars. When we adopt the levy in November, we'll have some levies set aside for capital improvements. I've been trying to get us in a position where the city can finance more capital improvements by levy dollars and not be so dependent on debt, and we can talk about that a little bit later, but it's basically looking at a funding source, and when you look at levy dollars, you're looking at users in year one, like in year 2021 paying for 21 projects, but the useful life of some of those projects go out 10, 20 years. And so is it fair to have current users pay for projects in year one versus spreading the cost out with debt? When you do that, you have actually principal and interest. It's like a home mortgage. So the users that, 4 years down the line, they move into the city and they use those assets, will be paying for those assets. But, some of the equipment and some of the other needs, I think, are more advantageous to finance with current funding dollars. It's just kind of a philosophy. We also have TID cash, which is the accumulation of tax increment financing in the districts. But sometimes we don't have that value that builds up or that taxes within the tax increment districts until later on. So sometimes we have to borrow for tax increment projects, and you'll see that in this plan. We also, just like for debt on the operations side, we have operational needs. We can look at fund balance, and we've talked about this when the city council looked at our fund balance policy. We set some parameters of how much fund balance we want to carry, And, if we get over above that amount, do we want to use some fund balance for capital projects? A lot of our equipment, is at the end of its useful life, but still has some trade-in value, and departments recognize that trade-in value, and that's actually a funding source as well. We have state and federal grants, donations. The transit is a fund by itself and has a separate set of funding through CARES Act and some other sources that are available. And we need to talk about projects. There's projects in here that have no funding assigned to them, and the funding has to be determined. One possibility is the use of the American Rescue and Recovery Act money, or ARPA, and that'll be a decision that City Council will have to make. So we'll want to spend some time talking about the projects that are identified. There's a couple of big projects out there. And when we get to the actual schedule, we'll look at it, but the radios for the police and fire are out there. And I think we have a parks project for the beach house is to be determined yet. It's not identified as a potential levy, and it's not identified as debt at this point. So there are some projects out there to take a look at as well. So, when we talk about debt, we talk about cash, when do you want to use cash? When do you want to use credit? In practice, unless funds are direct expenditure offsets or cash contribution, we have to look at funding these projects until the revenues are realized. When we look at special assessments, and right now when we use special assessments, the property owner has the ability to pay that over a period of years, 10 to 15 years. So obviously we don't have that cash in year one, so we have to look at that. And we can talk about, in general terms, where that special assessment fund is. We've utilized debt to borrow for special assessments since 2018. I think we'll have to finance some special assessments, maybe not all, and we could talk about that. We got some grants coming in. I talked about the tax increment projects. And again, sometimes we want to do those projects in year one, even though that increment may not come in until future years, so we have to look at financing that as well. So again, the city tries to use some direct cash and levy for capital projects, but it also relies on debt to finance it. And usually debt has been used as a funding mechanism just to do the cash flow process as we move forward. Just a brief explanation on debt. As I mentioned earlier, debt, bonds are 20 years, notes are 10 years. They're considered tax exempt for the investor. General obligation debt also includes state trust funds, but instead of going to the market and issuing bonds or notes, we get the financing from the state. The state, through property sales and one other source, has a pool of money that's available for governments to borrow. But when we do the borrowing through the state trust fund, we actually pass a resolution and set up a repayment schedule for that.
Typically, we reserve the state trust fund for items that are ineligible for bonds, and anything that can be deemed a private benefit, a TIF district, if we're doing some type of development, there may be some perception or reality that it's providing some indirect benefit. The WRS buyout, we had a debt that back in 2014, we decided to pay off from the Wisconsin retirement system. The beneficiaries of that debt were actually the city employees, so that was also deemed a private benefit, and that's why we use the state trust fund. So we don't use it a lot, and sometimes seldom we miss something on the borrowing for whatever reason, a new project comes up, whatever reason. We use it for that, just to kind of do mop-up detail at the end of the year if we think it's necessary.
Yeah, typically the bonds and notes, the bonds have statutory limitations of what can be financed by it. Notes is a little bit more flexible. Again, those are tax exempt, but private purpose or taxable. We have the ability to go to the state trust fund. We can also do taxable bonds and notes, but they just have a slightly higher interest rate, and we don't do it too often. So for the utilities, water, sanitary, and storm, when we do debt based on the fees or the revenue collected by those utilities, they're not directly backed by taxes. They're directly backed by the revenue of the utilities. Again, that's considered slightly riskier. If you looked at the interest rate spreads between the general obligation bonds and the utility revenue bonds, there's probably about a 10, 15 basis point, a little bit higher for the utility debt. But it gets to the point where the utility is paying for those debt. General obligation, again, is backed by the full faith and credit of the city. Tax dollars are pledged, most reliable debt, lowest interest rate, and it's a good funding source. Other general obligation debt, again, if we finance special assessments, that can be tax, that could be general obligation debt. TIF projects, if they're not to the benefit of a private developer, so if they're for the public good, they're considered eligible for general obligation debt. Again, we try to keep our debt for things that have an economic life greater than 10 years. So those are some of the things there. And then under the state of Wisconsin, there is a capacity on how much debt you can actually issue. And that's 5% of your equalized value. And we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. So we've been fairly aggressive in trying to pay off our street and stormwater programs. We've shifted utility debt to the revenue bond programs. We've had some pretty high profile TIF projects, and we got some more, I think, on the horizon. We've worked at the Best Western Hotel, Aviation Center, Oshkosh Corp, and now we're looking at the Sawdust District area and some other things. We've tried to use grants where we can, like at the Riverwalk. We try to limit the use of debt to 10 years, but sometimes we've gone out a little bit longer, and then we have borrowed for special assessments. This is really small. I'm going to call up the spreadsheet itself. But what we've done last year and in prior years is looked at how much debt's coming off the books, how much debt is being taken on, and that gives us a balance at the end of the year, because our general obligation debt is a net debt at the end, is the debt outstanding at the end of the year. I've got a column for the changes, but the big thing is equalized value. If you look at, if you can read the top line of this for 2016, you see that the equalized value growth was less than 1%, and before that, from 2012 to 2015, the growth was pretty much non-existent. It was in that 0 to 1% range. But you can see in 2017, 2018, 19, our growth has been 3 to 5%. In 2021, we have some preliminary numbers. This is just an estimate. I've talked to the assessor. This is from the state of Wisconsin, Department of Revenue. But right now, our equalized value is estimated to grow by 8%, which is a huge growth. And that's based on current real estate conditions. If you've talked to anybody who has sold a house or trying to sell a house, the sale prices are coming in much higher than the equalized or the assessed value. And the state of Wisconsin actually compares our sales. At the end of the year, they do a comparison, and they say right now, on average, in 2020, we were about 80% or 88% of our assessed value to equalized value. So if a house sold for $100,000, chances are we had it in the book for $88,000. Okay, that equalized value is going from 88% down to 80%, and it might be a little bit lower once they figure in manufacturing and commercial and everything else. So we're estimating an equalized value of 80%. Again, it's an estimate, but we think that's a fairly conservative estimate, and we think that that ratio actually might be coming down a little bit higher, and we might have some additional equalized value growth. We kind of talk about equalized values a little bit more at budget time. The taxes are spread based on the assessed value. Okay, so that's an important thing to remember. However, when taxing jurisdictions like the county or the school district that go into different local units of government, they spread those taxes based on the equalized value because people are at a different ratio of assessed to equalized, and to make it fair, they actually levy those taxes that go across different jurisdictional boundaries on the equalized value. So like the technical schools, and again, the county and school district. So when we get to calling up the spreadsheet, right now we have $18 million recommended for 2022. And that's something that you are up for debate. We've ratcheted back down to 15 million for years 2023 through 2031. When I first started, we were probably at that 70-some% of our debt limit. Right now, as it stands, by the end of this year, we would be at 50.26%. We'd be below 50% in 2023. And by 2021, we'd be at 46% of our total legal debt limit. Long Range Finance, when they did their debt policy, talked about staying below that 50%. They also have some other measurements. But this just looks at the percent of our debt limit capacity.
And all that Russ did, at least in this model, and I promised the mayor we were going to have the spreadsheet, so you can have fun with it. You'll see how it flows. But the scenario that Russ has in the yellow on the equalized value, we're only estimating a 1% increase in equalized value. That's just to be very conservative, at least in this presentation to you. So that 46% assumes only 1% growth.
Correct.
And for the next couple of years, I think you can expect to see that to be more aggressive than that. But that's typically Ellers. On a very optimistic day, they may go 2%. They're going to be very careful because they don't want you to get ahead of yourselves in saying, oh, we're going to be able to do all these things. But that's really where our capacity to borrow lies, because you can see that even with an 18 million borrowing, our debt cap just stays about the same. You know, it's 50.2 to 50.6. We're still in the range. So that's, you can see that as long as we can, and I think a few years ago, you know, the term I used was favorable economic conditions. Right now, we're in favorable economic conditions. Is that an opportunity to do more? And I think that's why Russ is recommending, and you'll see that with the projects, recommending 18 million in borrowing is really to keep us afloat with the projects that are out there.
Additionally, the interest rates are ridiculously favorable at the moment compared to history.
Assume they continue. And again, you know, if we go and adopt a plan and say we plan on 18 million and the rates, something happens, we just have to kind of scale back our plan a little bit. So there's enough flexibility. But the reason I like doing the CIP first part of the budget process is it kind of lays the foundation of what we need to look at. But, you know, who knows when the real estate bubble will burst. And it will burst. I don't know if it'll be next year. I don't know if it'll be 3 years. I'm just going based on historical trends. I'm pretty good at looking at the historical trends, looking into the future. You know, one can make an estimate, and I try to do that, but, you know, everybody's going to have their own opinion on that estimate.
Just one quick thing to add, I think, for those council members that were here and looked at this chart in the past, you know, when we had the assumptions built in, we thought that would take us, 10 years to reach that 50% level?
Yeah, 2030. 2030 initially, I think. It
We
was.
had an ambitious goal to get to 50% by 2030.
Whereas
And
now,
I'm not being sarcastic. That was, we're like, we think we can do it. And it was almost like a rousing, let's do this. And now it's like, well, the economics are working in our favor.
So
Now,
it's
we can
kind
show
of-
you when the economics don't work in our favor too. And that's part of the scenario as well, because you gotta temper the good with the bad, and we will go up and down. That's just the nature of that beast.
but at
Yeah,
least
I mean-
right now, we're accelerated by almost 10 years, which is good
But you can
news.
look back to 2016. At 2016, we were still almost three quarters of our debt limit was used up. We were at 73%. So, yeah, that's what the city was faced with. So if you go back to 2014 and you do this projections that I have in that previous slide, you can just get a visual of what happens to our percent of debt limit. Again, some of the growth on the equalized value is minimal from 23 on moving forward, but it's still trending downward slightly. But we've had very good progress in reducing our percentage of debt limit over the last couple of years. The other way to look at this is the blue line is our existing debt. The red line is our debt limit. Again, with those assumptions in play from 2022 going into the future, that shows what that trend line looks like. And then you can see some of the historical data from 2015 to 2020. And that gap certainly, widened, which is a good thing, which is what the city was trying to do. So if you look at the CIP plan itself, we have just almost $15 million of projects that we have identified as things that should be considered. Again, I talked a little bit about special assessments, and Mark keeps asking me where I'm at with our special assessment fund. We have our audit numbers are in. We're doing the schedules right now, and I need to get that updated to look at our special assessment fund. But there may be a need to borrow up to as high as $4.8 million for special assessments. I don't think we have to go that high. We also identified $300,000 in the state trust fund loan for refuse trucks. So if you add up those three numbers, the 14.9, the 4.8, and the 300,000, you come up to a little bit over $20 million worth of projects.
For the new council members, I think it might help to understand the special assessments. Essentially, we're a bank for people who want to finance their special assessments. A lot of people come in and say, my special assessment's $10,000, here's $10,000 and we're done. But there are people, and particularly it ends up being people that don't have the financial resources, and we allow it up to 15 years, they pay it out over 15 years. Then we become a bank. And at that point, we charge an interest rate, which the council has taken down, recognizing the people who need it the most can least afford it. But when we become the bank, then where do we get the money from? About 7 years ago, the auditors were here talking to council saying, your special assessment fund, your bank, is in the negative because we've loaned out so much money and so little has come in initially that we have a cash flow problem. Now, it was okay back then. We were in the hole, in the red, about $4 million. But because TIF 7 still existed, which had millions of dollars, cash flow wise, we were okay. But we knew that TIF 7 was closing soon, so we had to start closing that gap. Part of what council did at the time was they really pressed Public Works. You need to get projects closed out so we can start sending out a bill. If we weren't closed with a project, you never got a bill. So then it was like, well, you were happy because you didn't have a bill, but we were carrying those bills on. That no longer applies. The council set a policy that Public Works has to get those out within 2 fiscal years of the project. So project happens in 2019, we got to make sure we get the bill sent out in 2021. Except that when COVID hit, the council made a wise decision. I completely support it. Was we got to give a break because all the uncertainty, and we were all worried about what was going to happen. So council said, don't send out the bills. So literally, we had the bills and we just held on to them. so now, while that helped short-term residents, we have to borrow because now we put ourselves back into a cash flow pinch. It'll catch up. It's not that we're never going to get the money. It's just that from a cash flow standpoint, we have to finance our bank for a while. Madam Mayor?
So do we have the total of what the special assessments are and then what percentage or portion is being financed by the city?
I can get that for you, I just don't have that number handy.
And that's really the question I was asking Russ as well. But part of the problem is that because we held off, we're waiting the auditor's final report on where the special assessment fund, because that's a specific fund, isn't it, Russ?
Yep.
So you'll be able to turn to a page in the audit and you'll see exactly the answer to your question dated December 31. But I think James is going to shed some light on it as well.
I think historically, as we've looked at the percent of residents, property owners that either, pay in full when they get the invoice or pay in full on their first property tax bill, it was around 50% or a little more that were paying in full that first year. I think it might have been a little bit more, but we had done some analyses over the years that kind of compared that, and I don't know if we've updated that yet. Well, probably not, because Pam is still getting all of the plan elections back from people. With not sending any out last year, there was no data to analyze, and with 2+ years worth of special assessment notices that went out this year, the city clerk is still waiting on all those elections, so we just don't have it yet to analyze.
And I believe we had in that same discussion a couple of years ago, the discussion about a replacement of the special assessment being somewhat curative, because it would come in as we're using it rather than this big chunk of borrowing. Had we had that in place, or should we go in the direction of like the transportation utility?
Yeah, this is just assuming the current program stays in place right now.
Okay.
Yeah, and and if we had done something like that, our cash flow would have not taken us down, and then slowly, the people who did still owe special assessments, they would take the balance and slowly it would wither away. In theory, it would wither away in 15 years because we wouldn't have assessed for 15 years and people would be paying. So you just kind of, but it's a challenge because we gave a year off, and so we normally float about $4 million in special assessments. Well, we didn't get any money. We got half of it on a regular year. People say they pay cash, so we got $2 million in every year, which helped our cash flow. And then the people who owed from previous years were paying us, so we were catching up. But now we just fallen a little behind, and I think that the coincidence is it's about $4 million. Well, that's about 1 year's worth of assessments.
Yeah. So right now, I think have the flexibility of not financing all of it, but just some of it. So that's why we're recommending 18 million. And again, as we looked at that, we put a placeholder. Again, it's just a placeholder at this point of $15 million for 2023 to 31. Again, with that 1% value and growth, our debt limit will be below 50% by 2023, 46% in 2031. We will see in a little bit, we do have monies that are levied. We try to keep that to reoccurring items with some of the facility improvements and maintenance and some vehicles. And the other question that I think at some point we'll have to have some debates, and I haven't had a chance to share this with the city manager, but I have it on my screen that I can pop up in a minute. But I've been playing with some numbers with the American Rescue Plan, the ARPA money, and we can account for we might be able to finance some capital projects with that, especially those funds that are considered lost revenue. One of the 4 categories is that the cities or the recipients of ARPA money can recover for lost revenue. And I'll show you that in just a second. So when we talk about projects or we talked about financing, what that really means for the city of Oshkosh.
Well, while you were out Friday, I was reading the the Federal Register.
Oh, I
Don't
read
ask me
it.
why I was doing that on a Friday
You're
afternoon.
bored.
I was, yeah, but there are some, yeah, so I think you and I are,
No, I got it.
On the
taken
same
into-
page,
I got
yeah.
it taken into consideration. I'll show you that in a minute.
but right now, the CIP before you has no ARPA funds pledged. However, page 28 that shows the summary and the to be determined, 2,155,000 is yet to be determined. So we've got to figure out a funding source if we're going to do those. And we're not necessarily saying that's the ARPA money, but we either fund it or we don't do them. It's basically that simple.
Well, I think that the big thing is the radios for police and fire, which is $1.8 million, $1.9 million, somewhere in that neighborhood of that $2 million. There's been discussions between all local governments and the county on how that might shake out. There's no firm commitment from the county at this point to do that. In the past, the county did fund the radio acquisition for all agencies, not only the city, but all the townships and villages and the other cities. But that's something that probably has to get done one way or another, and we got to figure out, well, how we want to finance that.
Just one last add to what finance director and city manager are saying. And, you know, I think Councilmember Mugrauer mentioned it. You know, the council really has a unique set of circumstances now with, you know, ARPA or debt reduction, potential infrastructure funding that we are still going to learn about, and then interest rates being at a low to consider a whole variety of things right now. So it's, you know, I'm old, I've been here a long time, and I can't remember a circumstance like this, you know, all converging at the same time. So it's kind of a unique set of circumstances for the council to be in this position at this time.
So what are some of our major projects for 2022? The park facility building is in the second year of a 3-year funding decision that the council made last year. The council decided to fund a portion in 2021. They identified potential $3 million of funding in 2022 and another 1.9, or maybe that might get adjusted for 2023. I think they're still working on getting those final numbers.
Yeah, that 2023 number will likely go up because construction costs have been going up, and this was done from 2 years ago
Yep.
now.
Other major utilities in there or infrastructure, Algoma Boulevard. And the interesting thing is we looked at the price, and this is total price for water, sewer, and streets.
Water, sewer, storm street, sidewalk, street lighting, paint striping, the entire project.
Have a figure recently that it's $1 million per mile.
10 million a mile.
10 million a mile.
Sorry, 10.
Well,
So that must be 1 mile
Algoma-
that's
stretch.
where we took it from. That's literally James like, well, here you go. Here's the math. So
That's what I was going to say. That's
Interestingly enough, Mr. Davis and I had done a similar calculation about a year or two ago, you know, before we had the estimates put together for Algoma, and we had come up with a very similar number, about $10 million a mile, and Algoma Boulevard is almost exactly a mile.
yep.
So is that somehow comparable to the $1 million mile down in Chicago? I don't think so.
now it's $10 million mile.
We wish.
Yeah, we wish.
Other projects that have been identified, and again, not sure where council wants to go, but staff has said the need to look at East 9th, the extension of East 9th Avenue. That's almost $6 million. Rosalia Street at 5.2. Bowen Street Interceptor at 5.1. Oregon Street, again, that's kind of been a phased-in project. They got another 4.1 identified, and East Lincoln Avenue at 3.4. So those are some of the major utility and street infrastructure, and then water and sewer have their own needs. Water at about $10 million and sewer at $2 million.
And the numbers with all the street projects include all of the sewer, water, and other stuff. You know, it's, these other water and sewer projects are just some standalone projects that the utilities have.
So, you know, we received individual requests from departments. I sat in meetings with the city manager and the department head, and we looked at all of the requests. To be quite honestly, we're not giving you all the requests. We kind of massaged it. We looked at what could be possible for 2022, 23. We shifted some projects around. We asked departments, you know, their priority. And we kind of use these factors in our prioritization. You know, we looked at whether or not the asset or the capital item is in immediate or imminent failure or a critical need of replacement. We've seen what has happened in communities where infrastructure doesn't get fixed, and there's some pretty substantial consequences. Whether or not we have contractual obligations or deadlines, previously established long-term commitments, we talked about that. You know, again, we're trying to come up with funding to match grant eligibility. We try to adhere to replacement schedules. Sometimes they get stretched, but sometimes, you know, the life cycle is pretty close to the replacement schedule that we have. We also look at, you know, public and employee health, safety, and security. You know, we're looking at the long-term infrastructure needs and making sure those are met. And again, looking at items that are coming to the end of their useful life, and we want to get those on the schedule. Again, when we try to stick to our schedule, we try to space out equipment needs and infrastructure needs so that we don't have a lot in one year. We've done that with some facility stuff. We try to be proactive on projects to avoid future maintenance costs, but sometimes that's inevitable. We continue to invest in the culture, recreational, and educational facilities. And we look at neighborhood development and improvements. We try to avoid, you know, that increase in maintenance cost. It's keeping to our schedules, and then also meeting the goals of our strategic plan are also all taken into consideration. Now, going through the criteria of just what we look at and making sure that our CIP meets all the plans and mandates and service levels and encourage economic development. So that's all there as well.
And you'll notice in the, especially with the projects themselves, we have a scoring system that the Long Range Finance Committee recommended to council and the council approved. And the departments submit their scores, and then I revise
Override
them. I correct them. Yeah, is that the term you used? Then I correct them. But you'll see a project score. 200 is a perfect score. We've never had a perfect project because there's as you can see, there's certain things that compete against one another. So you don't necessarily get a perfect score, but it gives us an idea of where these things fit in with all the criteria that Russ talked about. So we've done that over the years. The utility projects generally come up the highest because they get a little bit, there's an economic development impact. There's also public health and safety, and sometimes we're under mandates. Those usually are ones that get really high scores. But you'll see a score and just randomly pull a page, and you'll see, 90 out of 200 or 100 out of 200. 50% of the total doesn't make it a bad project. There are a lot of projects in there, but it's a very strict rating system to demonstrate that we've got a whole range of projects here that are worthy of consideration.
So if the max is 200, why would it be 90 out of 100?
I'm sorry, I meant 90 out of 200.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. So the plan itself, we have the workshop tonight. We want to talk about the plan. We present the plan to the Plan Commission in August. We actually look for a recommendation and an adoption by the council of the plan in August. Individual projects are looked at as part of the operating budget, and we adopt and levy for those projects as part of our operating budget. So those are kind of the steps moving forward. Mark talked about the individual sheets. The email you got late last week has the individual sheets. And if you, again, need something or would like to ask a question on a project, I think we can take it, but we didn't ask all the department heads to be here this evening. We really wanted to go over the plan itself and talk about, what's your comfort level on debt and what are some of the funding options that we want to look at. So that's pretty much the quick PowerPoint that I threw together. Let's see once here. So let's see if we can make this bigger. How do I make this bigger?
Lower right corner.
Yeah, right there.
So I don't know if you want, if you're comfortable with $18 million in debt next year. That's the equalized value we have. The yellow is all 1% growth. The $15 million, again, are just placeholders moving forward. And if anybody has any comments, suggestions, thoughts on their comfort level of issuing debt.
Russ, if you could walk through a scenario for the council that keeps the percentage of debt limit at 50% and show them different ways in which you could still reach that depending on how the scenario goes. So like if we did 2% growth or 3% growth in the equalized value, what the borrowing could go to, or likewise, what would the equalized value need to be if we wanted to sustain 18 million? So,
Well, if it was 2%, oops. And we did the 18 million and the 15 million.
yeah, just see what happens with 18, and then so you can kind of illustrate to how much, what kind of growth we'd need, because obviously that would get us down to 42%. But if we could hover near 50, if you could plug 18 in to 23 through, I guess, a few years and just see where.
How far out?
I'll just take it for the, yeah, I guess,
All the way?
yeah, sure, why not? I mean, it's just an exercise. So you can see, and this is not planned, but I'm just really good with math. But see what a modest 2% growth, steady, does. It keeps your rate hovering around 50%. It goes up and down with 18 million. Now that's just the number. If I guarantee you it will not stay at 2%. It won't stay at 8% either. So you have to just say, all right, what's going to happen? It'll go, over the course of the next decade, it's going to go down to 1% a year for a couple of years. And we might be able to ride a pretty good clip at 5, 6, 7% for a couple of years. But that's about it. I wouldn't count on it. So you moderate the assumption just to give yourself an idea. 5 years from now, you'll be playing with these numbers just like you are tonight, but this just gives you one example. And I just did that clearly for illustration purposes. And I know, Madam Mayor, that you really like throwing this at. So I just wanted to do one illustration. And if, I think it helps everybody, because you're thinking one way and somebody else is thinking another. Just, more conservative, less conservative, more aggressive, less aggressive, that type of stuff.
And I would just add too, past performance is not an indicator of future performance, but I think it's also important to realize, what the growth has been going backwards too. It hasn't been much at all for an extended period of time. So I think it's a consideration.
So for some additional context for our two newest members, this thing shows in the debt principal taken on, that's the third column over from the left. We didn't take on $30 million in 16 or 21 and 19. We refinanced, and so we were able to do some savings. So in that time frame, we were averaging, this was before my time, but we were averaging about 11.4, 11.5 in new debt every year.
You can kind of
Up
see.
until last year.
You
And
can kind of see
Mark
that.
talked us into a higher number last year, let's put it that way.
Well, the other thing to look at 2016 is you retired 36
Yes.
and you took on 30. So you,
Refinance some old
That was all
higher interest
refinanced.
debt, different things like that.
And
So
the
that's
key
where
there
it shows
is,
up.
the key's right here.
So.
If you get, if you have a number in the red, you're lowering your overall debt. And that's really, and that was a big deal because we weren't getting movement on that debt percentage with equalized value. We were getting no movement. Now, and that was, certainly I think in Russ's and my careers, this was an unprecedented run of 8-9 years where we had nothing.
Bad growth. Or
Evident
stagnant
growth.
growth, really.
Stagnant, yeah.
So will that kind of growth continue? That's what you have to kind of ask yourself too. It's you don't want to be too crazy, but is it reasonable to expect that it's going to continue to be no growth when it has been no growth for over 10 years?
I don't know, does anybody want, I mean, that was just one illustration. One of the discussion points that the council's had is, do we put more into facilities? Because that 18 million is taking care of just this year's CIPs, a little bit of backfilling the special assessment fund.
What does it look like for 2022 to go 20?
Doesn't get you to 51, but it doesn't get you below 50 either.
That's still assuming a 2% is still over
Right.
there.
So just for fun, because this is part of what the exercise is, Russ, if you could just put in for, I don't know if you can just put in for 2022, like a 6% growth,
Yeah.
just on that one. And again, just
Since
like,
we're projecting 8 now, right?
no, we're projecting
this-
2%. And I'm just saying the next year, because the 4821 that you see for 2021, that's the estimate we recently got from the state.
What kind of growth you
Right.
want?
Let's put 6.
Oh, help me out, Paula. Let's go back.
Oh, yeah, that'd be a little optimistic. Oh, times 1 point.
Oh, maybe it's. I thought that's
Just
what
put
I put.
1.06.
Thought that's what I put in.
You did, but you didn't close the parentheses.
Okay.
I guess while he was doing that, what I was referring to is,
No, that's not right.
Russ talked about our
Check that
preliminary
again.
estimate being potentially 8% for this year. So I think
You're testing my
suggesting 6
skills.
for the next year.
Wouldn't you just put
It's
it
still
in the
conservative,
assumed annual increase right there?
It'll change all of them then.
It'll change all of them, yeah, I just
That's
wanted
right.
to put that one times 1.0, or previous one
That-
times 0.06.
It should be that. I know what I did wrong.
Yeah, there you go, times 1.06.
Times 1.06.
So that just changes that and then changes everything else. You can see that go into 20 with a slightly more optimistic view of what that year will be. Now, would I do that 6% through the whole rest of the decade? No. It's not gonna happen. But it just gives you one good year, lets you do something like that. Pick the year and, you can,
So on our criteria, though, I didn't see in our list, but I thought we had talked about before, was the favorable economic conditions.
we've kind of gone away from that because I thought we got the point across. But the idea is that that's still, and it's still for the council to consider. Favorable economic conditions enable you to to look at that. And then I think Deputy Mayor Mugrauer also said, low interest rates, and we had that same conversation the other day.
Of the FEC, right?
Yeah, and that is also, it is an FEC. That was the short for favorable economic conditions. But,
Another
I wasn't sure if you guys bought into that. So
Not that I want to, make Russ go crazier than he already is, but, one thing that we had talked about for years before this favorable economic conditions year was the idea of retiring all that debt in 10 years. I mean, you could also think about it, if we still wanted to hold to that, what could we do? It looks like we're going to be able to eclipse that amount pretty quickly. So if we kept that same assumption of trying to get to our 50% debt load, what could we do between that time frame? I think we can hopefully clearly exceed that. So I think it's important to remember what our assumption was prior to this too.
percentages went up in the previous. You did something?
I went back down to 1%.
You went back down to 1%.
I went back down to 1%, other than this
other
year.
than that year.
This year's 6 and this year's 1.
That's what happened. Okay, but okay, that makes sense.
I can go back to 2 if you want.
No, but that's a good point, because what we did was we took the mayor's suggestion of bumping up 22, for example, to 20 million, and we went 6% for 2022 on the equalized value, but then went back to 1%, a little more careful. And you see the percentage starts to inch up a little bit. So, to the point about favorable economic conditions, this would not be a desirable outcome. Something else would have to happen. Either you borrow less or you cross your fingers and you hope for a little better value. But again, that's all saying it's all about equalized value. It's not all about equalized value, because the levy is still the levy, and you have to approve a levy every year. And if we say, well, 5 years ago you borrowed, now we're paying for it, then you got to pay that. You've got to pay because we've pledged our full faith and credit on the debt. But then we have wage increases and we have this and that. So it's not just about, you can afford it, because that's like the car salesman saying, how much can you afford, rather than saying, I don't want to tell you what I can afford. I want to pay the lowest interest rate possible. Don't tell me, then you'll be paying 18% interest because they've convinced you. No, we're not selling you cars here. And we have to be cautious, because it's not just about that percentage. The percentage is a good measure from a long range standpoint, but you're the ones that have to approve the tax levy every year. And you gotta look people in the eye.
So big picture, that's the balancing act. Like, Mark and I have had this conversation before, but previous councils were conservative in their new debt, because it had gotten to such a high point, a concerning point. But we're also we're in an inflection point of, we have a lot of needs that have not been addressed for not just years but decades.
Centuries, in some cases.
We've got a facility study that's being compiled as part of Mark's goals to tell us, an all-in one-stop shop glance, what our real needs are going out the next year, 2, 5, and 10 in terms of facilities. So it's a struggle. It's a balancing act, because we want to reduce our debt. I have no interest in watching that net balance number go up, but I also have to balance the needs of the community. But what Mark had said was actually one point I was going to make. Just recently we were able to capitalize on significant levy reductions in terms of our debt payments. Mm-hmm. That helped us last year. That was a big, $900,000 help, I think it was, in terms of things we could do. Well, a few years of, compared to 2 years ago at 12.5, $7.5 million debt increase this year will equate to, X amount of hundreds of thousands of dollars down the road in terms of levy payments that we've got to find a way to fund. So it's a big balance.
That kind of gets to something I wanted to touch on a little bit. And similar type of, close that. Similar type of spreadsheet. What we got was $20 million in ARPA funding. If you look at, this is now known, what our revenue loss was for 2020. Okay? So with the audit numbers, and I broke it down between city and room tax. We lost $5.2 million in city revenue, overall revenue, because the application for ARPA allows a 4% growth factor. So we could take our 2019 base, multiply by 4%, look at what we collected in 2020, and we were short $5.2 million. In addition to that, we had room tax, but not all that stays with the city. That's about $1 million, and 60. Under the arrangement right now, 60% goes back to
CVB.
Visitors Bureau. Now, going into the future, we can also look at our lost revenue in 2021, 2022, and 2023. And on this, right now, I have it set up, so in 2021, our lost revenue would be at 3/4 or 75%. Yeah, in 2022, I did it at 50%, and in 2023, I did it 25%. I could easily make these 0. I could easily have made them 1. But if you just assumed that lost revenue was going to continue in 21, 22, and 23 at 75%, 50%, and 25%, we'd have about 4.6, almost 4.7 million dollars remaining. Now, if that was 1, if I change these all to 1, and I can do that really quick, that would use up all of our ARPA money, and say that all of it was provided to the city. We'd be actually overcommitted, or have more lost revenue than our ARPA funds by $4.8 million. But right now, if you say we get nothing in these future years in lost revenue, you can see that, come on.
I thought we were at 3 for the lost revenue for 2020. 3 million.
I was working on audit. I had some preliminary numbers. These are based on the audit numbers. So I feel pretty confident in the 5.2 and the 1.
You may have also been listening to something that you and I talked about with respect to the room tax. And I was projecting, and this was literally me on the back of a napkin, thinking about $3 million for room tax over the entire period. But that was before the rules came out. Lost revenue cannot be recovered after 2023, the fiscal year. And I think the reason for that is you got to commit it by the end of 24. We won't know the 2023 loss until this time in 2024.
Right.
Because you got to close the year and all that
Right.
stuff. So that's the logic behind the feds cutting it off at 23. It really makes sense now.
I guess what the point I was trying to get across is if you were uncomfortable with debt, or you were looking to bridge some capital projects, because this is lost revenue, it doesn't have to fall into the other categories. We can use this for any capital projects. So we could use the $5.2 million for capital projects without impacting the levy, without borrowing for additional funds, at a minimum.
Part of my reading the Federal Register on a Friday afternoon was because I was curious as to, you had asked a question the other day about, I thought we can't use ARPA monies for street projects.
Right.
And that is correct. However, the way the rules are written, and now it's even clearer now through the Federal Register, they want you to say, you can say it's lost revenue. They do ask you what you've done with the money. The reason they ask you what you've done with the money is to make sure that you're not using it for pension relief,
Tax
taxes,
relief.
Direct tax
Yeah.
relief.
direct taxes, or to pay off a debt. But there is a question about debt for room tax, because I found that too.
Well, I didn't see that.
Yeah, well, it was sort of a question and then no answer.
Ah.
So that was just, so, but the idea behind it is that as long as we're not using it as a backwards way of trying to fund some unfunded pension, we're okay. All that means is it gives you flexibility. That's really, anytime council gets maximum flexibility, then you get to decide.
So then, because special assessments are not specifically the levy, could those be directly or considered direct assistance to households in that other category? Or does that fall more in the covering with recovered lost revenue through ARPA?
If you're asking, could we identify people who have been impacted by COVID who we've also assessed, we've added insult to injury?
Yes.
I think I would feel comfortable saying, yes, you could do that from a regulatory standpoint. Whether four of you agree to that is a
Right.
different story, but would I say, Russ, wouldn't you say if they could identify people on, I don't even want to say the street, because if I say it, then people are, but Street X, and Street X, there are so many people, you probably have to make sure they qualify or can demonstrate that they were impacted, but I think the feds are like, if you think that this group of people have been impacted, then you can say this group of people are impacted. So I think you have that flexibility to do something like that. For example, haven't looked at that, but I'm just answering a
I'm just curious.
hypothetical
Yeah.
question, yeah.
Russ, can you, not that I want to get anywhere in the weeds on this one, but you're projecting lost revenue out through 2023. Can you give a brief example of what lost revenue might look like in 22 and 23 that you possibly could expect, that you're projecting it? Because, I mean, obviously, one of our biggest ones was, we didn't have special events that we didn't bill for.
Right.
That's a big one, overtime costs and all those things. That was one of the larger ones we had, but
Just, again, we're kind of,
all guessing, but I'm just wondering what you were.
and that's why I put in, thinking that 3/4 of the year.
In 21, we're going to have loss. We just don't know what it is.
Right.
But and then 22 and
And
23.
I just assumed for 2021 that it was 75%
Okay.
of the year. And I don't know, if this 50% and 25% makes sense or not, but I just did it so I could play and look at what the impact might be.
Okay, that's okay.
I have not detailed our revenue loss. I've detailed our revenue loss for 2020, and I have the individual sheets to support that. So I'm very comfortable in the 5.2. I have not taken that 2020 numbers and projected those forward. Now, the nice thing under the ARPA rules, and they use the term counterfactual revenue.
Is making up
Yeah,
words as they go
whatever.
now, or what?
Yeah, they're just making them up.
No, you get that.
Wait a minute.
Okay, so if 2019 is base year, let's just say it's a base of 100.
Yep.
We get to use 4.1% each year above that. So 2020 was 4%, 2021 is 4% above 2020.
Okay.
So until we get to 4% increase in revenue, we're going to have some lost revenue.
Okay. On paper, lost revenue.
On paper, they call it
I get you.
counterfactual.
One of the things we can't do, in using these projections that Russ put together is a good point. We can factually state today that the revenue loss for 2020 is real. Everything else is a projection for 21 and on. So we couldn't say, well, let's take those numbers and, we can spend all of our ARPA money except for that 4.6 million. You can't make that assumption because we don't know what the revenue loss is going to be. Do special events recover? Does parking ticket revenue recover? How quickly does room tax recover? We're going to have EAA this year. For July, the number for room tax is probably going to be close to previous years, which will be great. But, you know, what happens with other months? They're not bringing back conventions. There's a big bump in weddings this year because things got held up. So the convention center is really not doing much more than weddings this summer. And that's not good for the hotels, except on weekends. I mean, that's all that they're seeing. So we could commit that $5.2 million. The council could commit $5.2 million today because we have audit proof that we incurred those losses. And council could say 5.2, spend it this way, that way, however way you choose to, as long as you don't spend it on a pension or something like that, one of the ineligible costs. But there's ability to do that. We're not suggesting you absolutely do it. We haven't made a recommendation in that regard yet, but this shows you what you got available to you.
You just hit the question that I'm gonna ask, so I'm gonna ask it. When are you gonna make that recommendation, at least for 2021's decision making? Because obviously we're in CIP now, budget's gonna roll out soon. When are we gonna know what your recommendations are for at least
I'm telling you,
next budget?
I'm telling you at this workshop right now, that if you wanted to discuss how to allocate $5.2 million,
That's the number that we should.
that's the number you should be working at.
I'd respond to your question with a kind of a question would be, are you comfortable with 18? Is 18 million borrowing sufficient? Do you want to borrow more? Do you want to borrow less? If your answer is I want to borrow less, then we're going to be recommending more. If you say, hey, I can go up to, the mayor suggested 20 million in one scenario, just, you know, that was a what if.
I wanted to see the difference.
Right,
yeah.
exactly. But let's just say we said, oh, we're okay with 20 million. Then I'd say, well, maybe you want to hold off on using ARPA money. It really comes down to your tolerance for debt. Is that a nice way to dodge the answer?
No, it is, 'cause
In a way, I guess what I would say though, I'm still back at ARPA versus CIP. So just bear with me for 1 second. You know, in addition to lost revenue, we can also make investments in water, sewer, and basically broadband. That's a lot of projects. One of the things that I wanted James to talk about, you know, when we look at a typical street construction project, and even if you look at Algoma Boulevard, you know, we talked about some of that cost being water and sewer. One of the things the city of Oshkosh has done in the past is all of the street, the payment for the resurfacing the street after the water and sewer has been fixed, has been a general obligation debt. Under state contracts, and James, I'm gonna ask you to jump in.
Well,
They allow utilities to pay for a portion of the street costs under the
I'll jump.
motion.
Yeah, I'll jump in right there, Russ. It's there's a couple of state funding mechanisms: the Safe Drinking Water Loan Program and the Clean Water Fund Program. The Safe Drinking Water Loan Program is obviously for drinking water. The Clean Water Fund Program is for sewer, sanitary sewer, wastewater. Both of those programs, you know, you can use those loan programs for the construction of water mains and sewer mains out in the street. Both of those programs allow for a portion of the street surface up to a maximum width of 10 feet to be paid for by the utility through that program. So, you know, if you were using, say Safe Drinking Water and Clean Water Fund loans to pay for water and sewer installation, those programs would allow you to, in our case, shift some of that street cost onto the utility and it be paid for in that loan program.
And we don't currently do that?
We do not, as Russ indicated, and that's one of the reasons he asked me to try to be here tonight to try to help describe it a little further. On a street reconstruction project, the entirety of the street surface is paid for by the street fund or the general obligation. We do not allocate any of that street surface cost to the utilities at this time. But with some of the funding options available to us here, with water, sewer, and storm being eligible under ARPA, we could decide that we want to redefine how we allocate that street cost. And that would then be an eligible cost under the ARPA rules.
It's neither
way we
right nor
understand
wrong.
it.
I've been in
But
every.
it's short term.
The logic is that if you were doing only the utilities, the utility would pay for everything, including the restoration of the road surface. If you were only doing a street project, how much would the street project cost you? And adding the utilities is just an incremental cost. Depends on which approach you take. And so the
And-
approach that we've taken is whatever it costs to do the street is what we charge the street. Now, part of that is that we didn't want to push it onto the utilities, because what happens? You push the utilities, well, it lowers the borrowing cost, but what happens? The rates go up. I mean, it's pick your poison. But with ARPA, the opportunity for us to do that shift makes some sense, even if it's only a short-lived switch.
And there's also a train of thought too, is, those utilities being present under the street surface and the trenches that were used to excavate them, there can be an increase in, the cost to the street. It becomes more of a maintenance. You can incur some more cost to the street surface. So there's a lot of logic behind, having those utilities pay for a portion of that street. It's just, that has not been how we have historically done things. Did I cover what you're looking for there, Russ?
Absolutely. I mean, and so when we start talking about Algoma and Lincoln and Rosalia, and what else was in there?
No,
Azalea is a really good example, because we're doing a large part of that because of utilities. I mean,
right.
it's bad. It sounds like you've traveled that, Rosalia. I mean, it's in rough shape, but it is about.
It's about getting a 16-inch water main in to help us with our main transmission system. We've got some larger main in CP and Otter CP area. Obviously, we're installing more of it this year with the CP construction. So it's getting that extra connection of that large main to help with our primary transmission out of the plant. And that line that will ultimately come down Rosalia, down CP, that ties into one of the river crossings to directly feed the south side of the city. So that's that is the big driving force behind Rosalia, is getting that utility work done. Similarly to when we started Oregon Street 3-4 years ago, the driving force was getting the sanitary sewer, to ultimately get that interceptor all the way down to Ripple and Oregon to serve development down there. The sewer started it. No one's going to argue that the street, didn't need work, but the sewer project and being able to serve that development, and because right now, we are still holding back that multifamily development because we don't have the capacity. We'll get there in 2024, but that's what started that, was utilities.
So one of the options to consider for city council is saying, okay, we have the 5 million and the one for 2020, leaves us about 14 million. How much of that 14 million do you want to use towards water and sewer projects?
I worry about using this fund. I know that that's one of the main things that the federal government has says we can use it for. I'm concerned about using it for utility work at this time. I think we have other needs that we have no funding sources for. Bluntly, we have a funding source for those utility needs,
Yeah.
but we don't have a funding source for 50 million in physical needs of this city in terms of parks, fire, city hall, senior library, museum. I can go on and on to every other facility we have. That's my biggest concern. We have a funding source for those utilities. So I know it's personal preference, right? But that's where I cringe at using it for reducing the cost of the projects that we've got on the books.
And I respect that opinion. Just want a follow-up comment is, if you take what you can in water and sewer and move it to ARPA for now, just under that assumption you would have more availability to do some of those if you had a certain comfort level on debt. I'm just throwing that out as a potential
So basically
point of
playing like
discussion.
kind of catch up, filling it like in the gaps. We have more.
And keep in mind, when the former councils were looking at that policy, it was wise, based on the conditions in those years leading up to that. We're in a different set of circumstances now.
They set you up so you have the ability to do things that they didn't have. They
Yeah,
couldn't, they didn't have the
wanna
luxury of
open a
doing
vein
it.
after this meeting, right?
So, I mean, the deputy mayor expressed his opinion. We have 7 different opinions, and they're all really good opinions, but I need one. And that's kind of it. It's like, how far do we go with ARPA? There are plenty of needs. I mean, you've given me some goals for the year. Facilities is a big thing, and we're gonna be, by August, the report will be ready for you to take a look at.
Right.
Homelessness is one, and it's also ARPA eligible, so that kind of makes it straightforward. You don't have to say, is it eligible? The answer is yes, it's eligible. And then, of course, what lost revenues really need to get backfilled? Room tax is something that needs to get backfilled, because that is, we kept paying debt that we had, and that's why the question, and I'll show it to you later, Russ, the question of debt for room tax, Russ had to find a place to pay that bill even when we had no money. So the room tax fund owes us a big IOU, and this might be one way to do it. But, if it recovers better this year than we think, I'm pretty optimistic with what I'm hearing about EAA. But the conventions, not so much. So we'll have a really good July. But what's gonna happen in August and September, it'll flatline a little.
So coming out of this, I don't know how late you had intended us to go, but coming out of this, you want at least one number. You want to know our comfort level for debt. At least pretty close, right? Because Mark asked the question before that I asked last year. Just straight up, I looked at every single council member and asked, what's your comfort level in debt? Because that's the deciding factor. Either we back into it with well, here's the projects we want to fund and do, well, then here's your debt, or here's your debt and find the projects we can fund and scratch the ones we can't. So you can walk into it or back into it, but
If you give us some idea of what your comfort level is, we can, look at the projects that have been identified for 2022 and determine whether or not, we want to massage that or not. And then, I think that goes a long ways. The individual projects will be discussed as part of that operating budget with the various.
Is there anybody here that's completely not comfortable with doing a 1-year 20?
You scroll up, what was I forget what we changed
Well,
to this one.
This is at 1% right now.
We moved that
But this is
22 number by
6%.
6%.
This is 6%.
That's a pretty aggressive number, to
But
be
even
honest
when
with
we
you.
were at the 2%.
Oh, we'll go back to 2 across the board? And then change 22 to 2%? Should we change that back? The 5
Which
million
one?
Russ?
Yeah.
Change that back to 2%.
Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, I thought
Should
that should do it, yeah.
might not.
Yeah, did it?
Still set it at 6.
No, I took it off. 28,
Yep, we're good.
28 plus, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So now everything's back to 2%, Russ?
Yep. No, yeah.
Or 1,
up at the top.
2%, yeah.
Sorry.
But we also kept it at 15, so if we did 18. Now remember, we show you this purposely so that you look ahead. But this is still all to be determined. Really, this is the number that you gotta focus on now. Because if our scenario's wrong, you're gonna adjust next year. But you just gotta, but can we start thinking this way of a bigger number? Russ, if you go back to 18 on that, because that's going to take remember I said I think it slowly starts creeping up a little bit, and I don't think you want that either. $2,000 really did it, Russ.
Oh, geez. Big fingers.
It's all right.
Now, under pressure,
Hey, while he's doing that, Mark, I just have a quick question for you on the fly. You know, you were talking about when we have to spend ARPA money and when we're going to know what we're going to know and all that kind of stuff. Will we know before we have to spend the ARPA money? Would we know what changes in equalized value might take place? So you could kind of hold that in abeyance as a reserve. So in other words, if we would know what the number is, whether it's 6% or whatever, then you could still cover it with the ARPA, so to speak.
I think we feel pretty good about the 6%. Otherwise, Russ wouldn't have put it on the chart. That 6% is plus or minus. That's you can take that to the bank. In 22 and beyond, that's where we're still. That's a guess. But to your
I mean,
point,
the 8%. You're talking about.
I'm sorry, 8%. Yeah,
That's
I
why
got,
I
I got
was
in my
sorry, I wasn't
6%.
fu-
Thank you.
I was
Thank you.
trying
Yeah.
to keep
yeah,
Talking
that 8%,
about beyond the 8% now. Is
yeah,
what I was
beyond the
at.
8%, I wouldn't be so bold. We can have fun with this, but to really say, oh yeah, 6% next year, take it to the bank, you can't say that. That's just very dangerous. But 8% plus or minus, it's going to be 8% for this year. But you can see that we just kind of play around with 51. So, you know, all that means is, you know, whatever, you adjust to actual, but then in those years. But for 22, the number of 20 million will still be below 51. You know, so that's not bad. Now, when you get to Mr. Fitzpatrick's and Mr. Urban's presentation on facilities, you know, then it's like, all right, are we going to use some of that extra borrowing for that? Or are we going to use some of that extra borrowing, or are we going to use ARPA? What are we going to do? Facilities have been a priority for the council. What do you want to do with that? I know I have a couple ideas where I think the mayor wants to go with it, with that extra borrowing. And those are things you're going to have to collectively make some decisions on. But if we can ballpark, I guess, poll the audience and just see where the comfort zone is, knowing what limited information you know now.
I'm comfortable at 20.
I don't see an issue with it. I liked that where we bumped it up for the 1 year but brought it back down.
The 15 or the 18?
The back to the 18, but the first simulation that we did.
Well, and I think we have the flexibility to change those future years based on what we have.
Yes.
But if we're just looking at the 20 for this, what, 2020, is that 2022? I mean, I think that sits around where we want it to be, if that's the goal, to be around, at or around 50%.
I would like to see it lower than 50 sooner than 2030 though.
Now we're so close, it's like, all right, yeah, and so I think we can get there because we'll adjust to actual in 22 because we're just projecting 1%, right, Russ?
Yeah.
2%.
Let's go back to the 2%.
that
Thank you. Good catch. So yeah, so that's 2%. If it's higher, then we're getting there. If it's lower, then you're going to go, you know what? Maybe 18 million for 23 isn't what we want to do. Mark, dial that back to 15. Where do we go? And so you can each year make
Right.
a change on the fly type.
Yeah.
Of thing.
Here we go.
But like you were saying, all of this has come together and been a very favorable environment for what we're trying to do. So upping it a little bit for this year, while we still can and have those interest rates and everything, would be a good catalyst to get things moving.
Where's Long Range Finance weigh in on this as a group?
We haven't met, or we didn't meet this last month. The plan would be to meet, I think it's next week, when we're supposed to, I don't remember if we had one for July because of the 4th or if it's in August, but we'll talk about it. There's obviously, Russ will bring us this sheet right here and we'll mess with it at some point, especially with the ARPA money, and once that hits the checking account, once it hits the general fund, council will be reminded that recently we passed a policy that says we shouldn't hold above X percent in the checking account. So by policy, the executive branch set a policy that says we shouldn't hold excess funds for too long, just doing nothing. However, these excess funds are from a different source. We didn't bond for these. We didn't take notes. We didn't underspend for these. But at some point, we can't let that fund just get larger without doing good things with it.
Especially when we
Exactly.
have plans on the shelf. that-
Correct. 2 years ago, I would be cringing and the smoke would be rolling out of my head.
I thought I saw smoke coming out of your head before.
Mark and Russ know
Just
that
an old fire.
from our I just haven't put out last year's fire since you're talking into that number. It's an interesting confluence of events, and money is cheap right now, and money will be cheap, should be cheap in the first part of next year for our borrowing, and that's when you invest the most, because that's when we get the biggest return for the longest amount of time. So
Bang for your buck.
you've got 4 people that said 20. I don't even have to say what I like. I think you move forward with that number pretty comfortably at this point.
I will share with you, again, we're just wrapping up with the audit numbers. I have seen the final numbers. I can tell you, and I'm comfortable in saying that our fund balance will be exceeding the limit that city council adopted by about $1 million
So
before ARPA.
we have funds available that we should do something good with right away.
Yes.
And just kind of how I said it, the ARPA money it's new money. It's not, like I said, we didn't underspend and all those things that drive that up. We should be really patient with the ARPA money.
We've got 3 years to work
Right.
with it.
Just patience is key on that, but yet still also
But
try
the
to,
work has to
we've
be
got
done
to,
by 2024,
The
though.
work, the fall.
we've got to also, we do have to respond to immediate needs too. So
And
there's a
we don't
balance.
know what infrastructure money might be available to us also. That's kind of an unknown.
Correct.
I know that we've been working really hard to adjust our bond rating too. And, the reduction in our debt certainly will impact that. So we very well could, have another positive outcome by having a higher bond rating too, with our, accelerated reduction in debt. It's hard to predict what Moody's is gonna do. I know, Mark and Russ would never try to do that, but we're going in the right direction, I guess, is the point of it all.
Yep.
And I think once we, now you got a preview that we may have $1 million. Is that $1 million over our max?
Over the max.
Over the max in our policy. And I know, I frequently refer to Councilmember Wojciechowski because of his experience on the county board. This governor at the top end helps us avoid this. Well, how did this happen? It's like, it happened because of COVID, because we put the brakes on so many things that now it's like, with this extra money, what do you do with it? Well, you don't just keep it in the bank. It's a dividend for our taxpayers. How do we use that dividend? And you got to be cautious about cutting something on the operational side and then have to make it up next year. You will pay dearly and regret that. But as Russ pointed out, he's proposing to up the levy support for capital projects by like
$400,000.
Yeah, like $400,000. That's
a
a
huge-
very good thing.
This is a huge swing in terms of
It's paying
investment
more
in capital.
cash, because we've been borrowing like 100% for capital projects. And that's not sustainable. That's like, never put a down payment on a
Right.
car or a house or anything like that.
Yeah.
We can't do that. And this is slowly getting us there. This extra $1 million, if we can use it for those types of things so we borrow less, it helps us there too. I mean, that's what this is about.
And I think too, you're making this decision now, but council will have ample opportunity with these other potential things coming forward to adjust it. You don't have to make this decision for the next 10 years right now.
What I would say, because one of the reasons we asked Mr. Fitzpatrick to be here was on the facility side. To get a dent on our facilities, we're gonna have to start investing. And I had told all of you at least once, that's always the hardest one to do. How do you say we're gonna renovate a building that's for city employees when we have streets that need repair? I can't tell you how much staff appreciates the fact that you are aware of this issue and you want to do something about it.
Well, these facilities are also accessed by our citizens, and so many of them are inaccessible for those who have any kind of mobility issues. We've had to go outside of council chambers and had to extend so long some of the virtual because we are not equipped to accommodate and host the people who pay for this.
I'm glad you brought that up, Mayor, because, you know, one
Playing
other,
into his hands, please be careful.
no,
Putting on a T for him over here.
one other project that we have, then, and I don't know how much Mark has talked to you about it, is we have an ADA study of all the accessible parts of all of our facility buildings. And, you know, I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that I think we're behind other communities with that study in and of itself. And what I think may happen when we get the study, and I haven't had a preliminary draft yet, but you know, it's going to illustrate that a lot of our buildings need to be adjusted for ADA purposes. So, you know,
Is the beach house under that study as
It will
well?
be.
Because that was inaccessible as
Oh.
well.
And I think, you know, you make a great point. It's not just for the employees, it's for the public. And they're the ones that are paying the taxes. They should have the opportunity to use these buildings to their fullest potential. So, and one last thing I would say too about this is, I think we do a great job. I'm really proud of the work that we do and our employees do. But I think, you know, based on my experience with our facilities, it's been very frustrating because we've never been able to do anything of any substance with it. I think the mindset of the employees, and meaning all the employees for the longest time, was we shouldn't even try to fix it because we won't be able to get it approved. And we'll just wait until it breaks and it's an emergency, and then it'll have to be funded.
Screen falling down into IT from the ceiling?
And you know, that's just the terrible way to run things and to plan for things,
And
so,
what Mark said one time was we're just retrofitting on top of retrofitting.
right? And
We're
we really
Slowly
take
painting ourselves into a corner.
everybody's
Exactly.
used buildings and then try to fix them up, and
But the hardest part is convincing the public that this is an investment versus, you know, spending the money here, because half of them don't come down to City Hall, let's be
Right.
honest. But it needs to be done just like all the other.
and I
All
know
the
there
other
are a lot of
projects
other
out there.
needs. James has a lot of different needs in the CIP, and we do. But I appreciate council just considering these facilities as part of this process too. If we can somehow recognize that we need to focus a little bit on those to start making a dent over time, you know, I think that would be tremendous.
Well, and I hope that, in addition to that, you know, when we talk about the infrastructure, whether it be in the context of what our traditional definition or understandings of infrastructure has been, or the designated categories that ARPA, you know, specify, that, you know, we're also looking at some of the mixed infrastructure, new ways of looking at water quality and stormwater quality management across that. Mark and I were just talking earlier this week, reading about mixed infrastructure, for example, you know, parkland and that, and some parks look like parks, but they're actual water quality management.
Well, South Park.
Yes.
South Park is that.
It's a dual purpose, really.
And the other one that you pointed out was, you know, Pratt Trail. It's a road in a park, but it's a road. And should it belong in parks? Should it belong in roads? Either way, Pratt Trail is in bad shape and needs to get fixed. Categorize it however you want, but are you willing to pay for it? And if so, how do we pay for those things? Because they're there. Historically, I think there's been a reason to kind of keep it. We want it to be classified as a street so we can get it for transportation aids. But if Ray can get a grant for a park, then we want the best of both worlds in case we do it. but does Pratt Trail
But it,
Pratt Trail needs to get fixed?
I have a different view of that. If it's, just happens to be located in a park and it's a city street, I'm not sure it should be in parks budget, but that's
Tell me you don't like the natural speed bumps.
There's a
and
natural speed
going.
They're skiing.
Come on.
But it's, yeah, it's a natural traffic calming mechanism.
It's traffic calming, but jaw rattling.
Oh my gosh.
Ball joints and
Literally.
tie rods, right? So let me ask a question you may not want to answer, but I want an answer at some point. We're comfortable as a body saying more debt, which addresses nearly all of the current requests that you've put forth as a 2022. Obviously, there's still plenty of unfunded things or things that could get moved up. We've got extra funds that are going to come into the general fund because of good numbers in 2021. We've got on the books at the moment almost 5.5 million that you say we can absolutely easily prove that is a revenue loss for ARPA that can flow into the general fund as well. When are you gonna come to us with, we think it's time to spend some of this, or here's some options to, because the reason I'm kind of backing into it, we've got all these projects we could all identify and probably have a wish list in our head of things that we would like to identify, right? This isn't, but we don't get pet projects here. This is about moving the city forward. But if we wanted to say, hey, 4 million of this, we want to use 4 million in cash. I'm just throwing a big number out there to address additional things. What's the cutoff point for us to tell you that collectively, so that it can be done in 2022 if we wanted to, like, or whatever number it would be?
I think that's November 9th when we approve the budget.
Oh, I would
that's when you're
offer, I
That's
would
when we approve
offer, if council has some idea, if council has any questions or suggestions, that they get to the city manager before it goes to the plan commission in August. Because then it can be incorporated into the plan.
That's true.
I know individually projects will be funded in November, but I think if, the reason we're having the workshop now
Correct.
is for you to ask questions on any specific projects or offer suggestions on timing. And I would say, as your finance director, if you can get, and I don't know if the city manager wants to create a specific deadline, but if we said by the end of July, it gives us enough time to get all the updates to the plan commission in August and before you, the second meeting in August.
How about if we put this on the 13th and the 27th agendas in July? Just so we just keep,
That's a blanket.
We need to
item
keep
for
talking
discussion.
about it,
yeah, just keep it and get a comfort zone. Yeah, yeah. Mine was more about, when do you do it? You gotta make sure it's in the budget.
Right.
Russ is saying, it'd be better if you got it in the
He
plan.
needs time to physically get it in the budget and
Yeah.
for people to actually hear about it.
And that's
talk
why
about
and that's why I kind of set up this whole process last year of how do we do the CIP adoption, and wanted to do it first. So I would, yeah, if we could do it as part of the July council meetings, that'd be great.
And one of the things too with the CIP going to the plan commission, their action is, determining if this is consistent with our comprehensive plan. So if we're going to be including additional projects to use that funding, I think they need to be saying, yes, these are consistent with our comprehensive
A
plan.
normal process should be followed. They should, whatever buy-in we normally get or process we follow should be followed. Before you,
Oh, go ahead.
can I ask then that city staff, and basically it's gonna be Mark, it's gonna make the recommendation to us, but identify things in the 23 or beyond and send us a memo with some ideas of,
What could be moved up?
here's some things that we think could be easily moved up, that could accomplish long-term goals that we have already identified, these aren't one-offs, these are already in there, they've been vetted, but that you guys need to get that to us sooner than later. And I don't know what that number is, but you need to give us that info, so otherwise you're gonna hear from us saying, well, I wanna do this one, and I wanna do this one,
Yep.
and we're not gonna get anywhere.
Yep.
One thing, along those lines, Mark has already talked to John and I about accelerating that ADA project so we can get that information sooner to try to help council understand what some of those issues
And
are
because
too.
the linkages are in with certain things in our strategic plan and with other plans.
Right.
I mean, strategic, big umbrella, comprehensive next, and
Yeah.
then there's the corp and the, there's all the different subs under there.
I know that's
The
work,
DEI,
but
the equity measures.
it's
Yeah,
needed.
we can certainly do that. And, with facilities, we're probably gonna be doing the facility plan, we're probably gonna be scheduling it sometime soon. I think what we're thinking is try to create an allowance that goes into allocating a certain amount every single year, so that we just do that. We already do that with roofing, we already do that with parking lots.
My only
Yeah, roofing and
concern
HVAC.
is that
We are not
Right.
expecting, we are not, from what last I heard from community development, we're not expected to get the results of the affordable housing study until sometime in August. And I'm thinking there may be, a number of council members who want to take that information to inform their opinions on this. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I don't know if is any of this helping businesses? And I don't know if this is the right time to be asking that, but like having any debt or something in the budget set aside to help fund like the downtown or small businesses in our city? And
There's-
just
there's-
asked.
There's two answers to your question. One is, ARPA does have that as a provision. Do we wish to do that? We were, the Department of Administration had reached out to the mayor and myself saying, if we put some money in for businesses, would you put money in for businesses? And we said, well, that makes sense.
Why wouldn't
Yes,
I?
why wouldn't
Why
we?
wouldn't I take their
Because-
money?
But we haven't heard anything
Yeah.
from that point.
Okay.
Same thing with housing.
But I think
And-
they're
and
waiting on us too.
Councilmember Erickson and I were just talking yesterday. It's like, she had heard some things about a housing program, and she said, do you think it's our ARPA money? And I don't think it is. But if it isn't, then do we leverage our ARPA money with others? Because if they say,
Yeah.
if you throw in 100,000, we'll throw in 100,000. Well, you gotta listen to those
Yeah.
offers, because you're crazy not to.
Exactly. Best bang for your buck. That's what we need to go for here with everything.
I'll
And-
take every federal dollar they want to give me.
Exactly.
The second answer to your question, though, is last year in April, in the initial concerns of COVID, you just gotten seated, we made some changes and put in some loan programs. Those loan programs have just gotten moderate to minimal demand. A lot of people didn't want to take on loans. Can we look at converting those into something
A
that,
grant or something.
Give them a grant.
if we go grants, we can do that, or do we target them for minority and women-owned businesses? There's other ways we can do this.
Okay.
Because we've already committed the monies, so we've got it. So I think there's opportunities, and I know Alan and Kelly have been talking to Go EDC. OEDC's going through some transitions, we're going through transitions in community development, but everybody's in agreement, we need to do what
We
you're
need
saying.
to help businesses. So I didn't know if that was the right time to throw that out there, but we really need to start from the ground up, because these people are losing their jobs, they're losing their entire lives because of COVID. And this is, how will we have a city without our small businesses? And that needs to be.
Sure. I think
Well,
along those lines,
policies, right.
I've talked with Mark about this part, and I mentioned it to Councilmember Ford too. I think for me personally, with the ARPA money, overarching, it's not so much about the individual projects that we fund for me individually. It's doing good work and doing good things for as long of an impact as possible, right? Getting
Yeah.
that biggest bang for the buck.
Big bang for your buck.
But using the processes we already have in place, that we shouldn't create new things that we're really bad at. Because the city government just doesn't do certain things very well. They're just, you don't. We've got the Community Foundation for an example. They have a grant process. If we're gonna do things within the community, we should use avenues that already exist
And
personally,
well,
or
yeah.
Go
You're
EDC.
talking about for the direct assistance to households
Correct.
and
Like
businesses.
Go EDC is a
Right.
great conduit. They have a process in place. We don't. Let's not create new things and be bad at it, and really
Delegate it to
inefficient
people
at
who
it.
know what
So
they're
just in
doing.
terms of those thoughts as well, just when we're talking about those types of things,
And can we use ARPA to do that? To
Well,
It
those-
qualifies,
It qualifies, yes.
assistance to
So
people
if
impacted by
citizens
COVID.
or nonprofits or
I think that
individuals,
also takes out.
put that
us
into
having
the,
to pick and
did we
choose.
get any of that?
Yeah.
A little bit, but I think we also, if I'm going to throw the community foundation under the bus a little bit, but they're a good partner.
Yeah.
So I think I can a little bit.
We can work with.
We can also give direction. You know, if it's X dollars, but we'd like to see 50% of that going towards this idea, this general concept, instead of being, if we're going to be picky and choosy, then we should bypass them altogether.
Yeah, it's,
I think we should do that part, that we've got to address
And-
these
and-
immediate needs, whether, you know,
Yes.
let's list some immediate needs that they can then take back to the community partners, and maybe they can leverage bigger dollars and, you know, do good things.
And Mark mentioned the state, but I know he's also had dialogue with the county too. So, you know, how can we maximize our dollars for all the people in this region and do the best
county's
that we can?
still up in the air on how
If
they're
they're
gonna
even gonna
fund it.
take the money.
And, you know, even that rumor was out there, and so you got that.
$30 million, let's not take it.
no,
Can give it to us.
I do want to,
Want
as
to.
long as we're here, I want to give some credit to Mark on that note, though. Because Mark and staff too, of course, Mark doesn't do it alone, but he gets all the credit from us at least, right? You know, regionally, you guys are leading the way in this process. Nobody else has any processes in place. You guys you're the test, and you're willingly being the test on this stuff. That here's a process we're going to use. Here's what we're going to try. We'll be the test kitten, and we'll try it out. And then everybody else gets to, you know, see what we did well and see what maybe we didn't do well. But you're trying something, and everybody else is standing still at the moment,
Well,
frozen.
And we got
So.
compliments, which, yeah, goes to staff for doing those public input sessions. County Board Supervisor didn't quite understand why they weren't doing something along those lines at the county level, and giving us props for doing those public participation. We're probably not done. We'll probably do another round of those at some point.
I'll just
I think-
add,
well,
I'll just
I-
add, because I know he won't say anything about himself, but, you know, he's really challenged all of us as department heads to try to come up with as many ideas as we can. And then also Russ, because of all of his experience, to try to maximize all these
Are you
different,
feeling breezy over here?
all these different revenue sources. So it's kind of fun, actually. It's really, it's different to be able to say, hey, we might have some resources to do things, and it's exciting for employees because they're like, hey, they're here to help the citizens, and it's like, hey, we could maybe do
and they
this.
actually have the resources to get
It's
things
very
done.
exciting.
Influence
So-
change.
With that said, you know, I put out that deadline of the July 2nd, and then it was like, well, July 9th. It isn't a grants program, so it's begin a dialogue. The mayor asked me, somebody reached out to her if we would make a presentation to one of the local Rotary clubs to get ideas. And then the deputy mayor said, can you come and talk to a Kiwanis club? Which brought me to Pratt Trail on a Friday morning because they're meeting at the Kiwanis shelter.
Watching the garbage truck bounce down Pratt Trail.
And so, but, you know, interestingly enough, I'm a former Kiwani, and one of their mottos is serving the children of the world. Well, guess what the Kiwanians were suggesting? There were multiple Kiwanians like, we need to do things for children. So it was interesting to hear those different perspectives. They're all out there. Now, what ultimately are we going to do? I don't know, but I think the more we got to just keep listening more, and I think the dialogue, even if, you know, it's funny because we're getting credit for taking all this dialogue and, well, how much have we allocated? Well, we've allocated zero, but we're getting the process so people are understanding what things are there. And that was part of my motivation Friday to read the register, and it's like that was a challenge. I caffeinated myself heavily on Friday, but there's a lot of stuff in there, and so how do we leverage it? And that was, you know, Councilmember Erickson asked me yesterday, what about housing? Well, I'd like to see what other people are talking about housing, because it's like we got to leverage. We got to just keep leveraging this stuff. The radios, there's a possibility the county might just fund it, ARPA or not. Now, I say a possibility. That's probably going to get decided more by the rural fire departments, because they're gonna have no money, and their ARPA funds are a pittance. It's not a lot. So if they fund it, then that that makes it easy, because the biggest part of that to be determined amount that Russ put together, out of 2.1 million, 1.9 of it's, 1.9 of it's for radios. Well, if the radio thing gets resolved, boom, our problem just went from 2.1 million to 200,000-ish, so makes it a lot easier. So it's all those things. So we've got to, so Russ's challenge of, hey, well, let's get it in the capital plan before it goes to the plan commission. We'll do everything we can and then hope that it's even better than that. Well, normally we've tried to go till 7, so if there's anything
normally it was
else.
7-ish, and I'm not interested in pushing it past that too much, but in terms of capital questions, sometimes we get there, sometimes we don't, sometimes we dive way too far in, sometimes, we should try to stay pretty high level here, but if we're not gonna do questions on capital stuff, allocation of that 20 million, when do you want it, and how can we give that to you individually and collectively? The same thing via funneling through the city manager like normal?
You're
or
talking about the borrowing itself?
Well, that too. I mean,
projects.
these are all projects themselves. I mean, I've got a question. I've got 3 notes that jumped out at me that we haven't been informed upon up to this point. Are interesting to me.
I would start
And
with
I would
me.
imagine there's a few others, and so if one of us goes, 5 of us could go, and it could be 8 o'clock.
We'll be
If
here up till 8
anything,
o'clock.
if you want
I'm
to,
not opposed to that, if anybody is up for it.
if you got a few questions, certainly happy to do that, but I think part of it is we can put it on the agenda for July so that you can reflect on it even more
I
from
like
tonight.
keeping things on the agenda and us keep talking about this, because if we don't, we're gonna fall behind.
Would
It's
you,
just a matter of the fact, things need to be right in front of you to get used and to get done with.
And ahead of that, council can get things to Mark and Russ, and then other council members can see it ahead, and, that, then we're
That'll
not
stir
spending all
everybody.
that time, yeah.
Yeah,
For everybody's thought.
exactly.
The only thought I had is whether or not there was any interest. I like the idea of having it as part of the agenda, but would you want to have like more of an open dialogue, kind of a work session prior to a council meeting? I'm thinking out loud, and I'm sorry.
No, that's
We
what
could,
you're for.
could we do like a half hour?
I wouldn't have a problem with that at all.
I think 5 o'clock would be appropriate-ish, because there are
It's
questions.
gonna be kind of rough for,
I know ish.
Yeah.
Ish is the word. Whatever works, but there is questions, and I think these forums are more conductive to having those conversations than sitting up there sometimes. And the meetings get long, and certain staff members are required to stand or sit around while we have those lengthy discussions sometimes, and they don't necessarily all have to be a part.
You want us to schedule early workshops for
on the
both?
13th and 22nd?
And
Yeah.
we're literally bouncing ideas off, like we're looking at each other versus not
Would it be
looking past
appropriate?
each other.
This is a productive setting.
Would it be
You're not really
appropriate to
constrained
maybe
by the
assign
formality of the.
different
Yeah.
departments for each of the 2 dates? So let's
Wait,
just
say
say,
that again?
Sorry.
What was that?
assign a department review or groupings, a couple, split it up.
Yeah, and that was the question I was going to ask the deputy mayor. Is the questions you're coming up with, are they specific projects or is it at larger scale? Because I think if it's specific projects, then certainly coming to city manager or Russ or whoever the the contact is that's listed on the form. I think may be appropriate for just answering some
Are you
basic
okay with that?
questions.
Can we do that?
Oh, yeah, I'm
Generally,
tracking
I would-
everything. I haven't heard a single bad idea. It's just that, but, James is the lion's share. You'd almost have to have James for one of those days.
Yeah.
And everybody else for the other date.
And that's usually why one of the 6 budget workshops historically has been,
All CIP.
me sitting here talking about the public works CIP. That's historically what it's been. But certainly if we want to have some of that discussion before then,
not always
I can
about-
arrange some of my staff to be here as well.
Questioning the project itself, and a lot of times it can come across that way. Why are you doing this? Right? Defend it, and it's really not. I don't think many of us mean to do that. It's more about I'm surprised by a couple of these things because we haven't necessarily seen them before. They weren't on the CIP last year, but now they're 2022 as it's a priority. It didn't even go from 3, 4, or 5. It's now in year 1. So it is more individualized, just in terms of my questions.
I'm
So
just a little-
I'll funnel them through direct for now, and we'll go from there.
I'm just a little confused about the et cetera projects that are just out there, not in even the next 5 years of the CIP.
Like the public works stuff for years 6 through 10 type of stuff, or like they were
No,
talking about the.
no,
To be determined.
the
To be
TBD
determined?
stuff.
Yeah, well, that's, I mean, between now and the time this is page 28. Between now and the time the budget, and I say by the time the budget's approved, we just can't put those in there unfunded. Between now and then. Now, the Plan Commission's job isn't to balance the CIP. The Plan Commission's sole
Right.
job is to say it's consistent with the plan.
Right.
So technically, we could submit to the Plan Commission an unbalanced CIP, but I think what Russ is saying is, if you can balance it earlier, because it's just gonna make it easier when we get to approving it formally in November. So this gives you an idea, but the radios are the biggest part of one, but then we've got fire engine, the whole Steiger wing modification. Mr. Larson would love for you to give him a retirement gift of funding the Steiger wing. But that's a $5 million, $4.5 million price tag. So we've said, we got to identify it somewhere at a certain point. Steiger wing is kind of one of those ones that Councilmember Hanson talked about. It's like we keep painting ourselves. That we've been making incremental changes, and we just can't keep doing it. We've got to do something with the Steiger wing. It's not accessible for the public. And I said nearly 100 years ago, the city accepted the Sawyer Home for a public museum. We own a public museum. If we're going to have a public museum, we gotta take care of it.
Yeah.
Well, most of the to be determined, we just gave you the go ahead to basically fund.
Oh, that's right.
Because
If
we
we went
said
into
you can go
20,
above
if
your-
we went up to 20,
You're basically there-ish. You can find some Post-it notes to shave off the budget and save that 155,000, right?
But I know, for example, and you've been so restrained, Mayor. Yeah, I know parks are one of those things that you're saying, hey, I want to throw
okay,
some more love that
I will
way.
put this out there just so everybody knows. My feeling is, we have beefed up public safety through police and fire over the last 6 years. And worked heavily on some of the public works. But we have not only neglected the parks building, but parks as infrastructure and dealing with our water quality and some of our, equity and public health measures. That mixed infrastructure concept, I feel like, of course, I'm a little biased because I am on the parks, but we have put them to the back burner for so long. That's next for investing in our community and future generations. That's my little pitch.
I'm not so sure we put them on the back burner. They get $2 million a year for renovations.
But we were
I'm just-
putting city streets into their budget.
So the thing that I always come back to is, you said back in like the 50s and 60s, they just didn't do road construction because they just couldn't agree on it, right?
30s and 40s.
30s and
yeah.
40s. So
I wasn't there for either of those
so,
decades,
and
by the way.
I'm just saying, I feel like, man, if they wouldn't have done that, we would have not been in this pickle. Because right now we're putting so much money into special assessments and roads and things that could have been done a while ago. And I know upkeep and everything, but we're playing catch up while also trying to fund new things. We're going in both directions right now, and we have to remember that.
It wasn't even that long ago, though. I mean, the 30s and 40s, I get it, but it was 2000 and it was 1990. They were making poor decisions. In retrospect, of course. No, but just like
But still, we're still
all these
trying to
years, yeah. We're just still trying to
catch up
catch
with-
up from 100 years and 30 years.
Exactly.
It's-
So that's why I always try
Yeah.
to remind people, like, when they talk, they're like, why are we not
I know,
putting money towards
you guys are,
this?
yeah.
It comes to
Playing
the
catch up.
it comes to the conversation Mark and I have had numerous times, and I know Mark mentioned it at I think the last council meeting. Of the 280-ish miles of road in the city of Oshkosh, 53 miles are rated a 4 or less on the pacer. That's, poor or failed. That's 20% or more of our roads are in that condition.
Not saying take it away from you.
No, I'm
Like,
And if they
I'm
all
making
cost-
your point of it was neglected for so long. That's how we got there.
And if they all cost
And
10
then we
10
can't
million
do
a
these
mile.
other ones
We
because
can't
half
do
of
the
it's
stuff
so-
we
billion.
actually need to do, yeah, exactly.
But if you looked
Not that
at
they do,
the,
but if they did.
pull up the, can you pull up the
Why aren't we
spreadsheet
doing
again?
this or that? Or why can't we
If
be like,
we-
yeah, the like, freaking catch?
If we were to continue to have favorable economic conditions, and we're looking at the 18 over the next few years as opposed to 15, and it's 10 million per mile, right?
Combined with
If we're
everything.
doing everything
If we're doing
underground.
everything,
Or
right,
water.
how many more miles would be added by going that direction? And I'm not saying we have to answer that now, but
A million is a mile. You need a
It's
half a
really
billion
more
dollars
about
to
what more can
just
we do?
and
Because
it's-
catch up to
10 million a
more
mile
streets.
is all
then we need to
inclusive
restart our-
utilities and everything.
I guess what I'm trying to say is it too much of an oversimplification to say if we're looking at 18s as opposed to 15s for the next 5 years, right? So that's basically only giving us like another
2 million.
mile and a half.
If it was dedicated strictly to road.
Exactly.
It wouldn't necessarily be restricted exclusively to roads. The slide that Russ showed up earlier during his presentation, we got a lot of big street projects going on in 2022. And, we got to get Oregon done, and that's part of it. It's going to be more sewer and less street for the next couple of years, right?
Yeah, from here on out, it is primarily sewer and then a patch. The last year of that project, 2024, the sewer will be constructed in conjunction with the County Trunk Highway I reconstruction project. I mentioned the STP urban funding early in the workshop. That County Trunk Highway I project is an STP urban project. So the street itself is being funded that way, and then the city is funding the sewer portion of it, but it's being bid as one project because there was no sense in putting the sewer in 23 and then reconstructing the road in 24 and basically shutting that road down for 2 summers in a row. It made no sense. So the county highway commissioner and I had come to an agreement that we would bid that as a single project, and we brought an intergovernmental agreement to you for approval last fall, I think it was, maybe, where so that the highway commissioner could get things moving on his end as well. So
But if you go to page 9, which kind of gives the summary of these streets, but also gives a little more depth. For example, in 2022, we're also doing Vine. The reason we're doing Vine is it's tied in directly with Algoma. We need to do Vine so that it fits in. But then you look a couple years down the road, Central and Cherry. I mean, Cherry is a relatively minor street, but Councilmember Hanson mentioned that one to me pretty darn early, and I'm
We
sure.
fixed McKinley too.
lived on
While
both.
we're at it.
if
Oh my
you look at the
It's
list,
on
I
there.
believe that's in there somewhere.
McKinley.
Yes,
Right under
That's in
2023.
That's in 23.
You hear that, college
Cherry's
kids?
24. But those streets are in horrid condition.
In all seriousness, I'm glad you do have Algoma Boulevard on there, because I know we had the conversation about, attracting young people to stay here, and honestly, the first thing that a lot of them see is the campus, and
That is
when
their
those roads are
gateway.
the first thing you experience coming to tour this college, it's kind of a turnoff to not just the school but the community. So I'm glad we're finally addressing.
I'll get on my stump another day about telling the university to quit digging up
Yeah.
High Avenue. High Avenue is only 9 years old. Look
Doesn't
at
look
all the
like it.
holes there. It drives me crazy. I'll
Yeah.
stop. The mayor and deputy mayor.
Just
heard
to
me.
save Mark, to get him off the subject, because I know I'll get on a rant about it, but, another thing that I think has changed since, the floods that we experienced not too long ago, and right after City Manager Roloff started, was an assessment of how we evaluate streets and how we plan for streets. And I know Public Works Director Patek was involved in that, and James, because his original assignments were just primarily focused on stormwater, has really carried that through. So it's not just pavement distress, and Mark mentioned it. It doesn't make any sense for us to fix the pavement and then have 100-year-old sewers made out of wood underneath there. So it's really, I think, the methodology and the analysis that Public Works does has really evolved over time, and that's why these projects are interconnected as they are.
Yeah, city manager mentioned Vine. You know, one thing that's it's not listed in here because it is just tied in with Algoma is there's a major storm sewer that goes down what is vacated Blackhawk Street through the university. That's where the Ped Mall runs through. About 8 or 9 years ago, that outfall collapsed, and I had to, I actually contacted the DNR and the Army Corps, and I got permission as an emergency situation to do a waterway project without a permit. And they just said, submit your application when you're done.
Was that bad?
It was that bad, and we literally just, we got out of the waterway to the first manhole, but I would venture to say about a third of Algoma Boulevard drains down that storm sewer. So we're going to be picking up where we left off, at that outfall and coming all the way up that pedestrian mall all the way to Algoma to tie that storm sewer in. It was the same thing with Vine Avenue. A few years ago, we replaced that storm sewer and outfall all the way through the Rockwell, what's it called now? Axeltech property. Sorry, dating myself there a little bit. Through the Axeltech property to get it up to High Avenue. But again, a big chunk of Algoma drains through that storm sewer. So we got to come down High to Vine and then come up Vine to Algoma to be able to drain that street. So there's a lot of these things that we have to put together to make the puzzle pieces fit.
And James, this may be more often to the ARPA discussion, but are you seeing and hearing from other public works and planning departments about working in more resiliency planning and things that can not just react to and repair to broken things, but building those things back better and more resistant to extremes coming forward?
I think we all look at, changing our philosophy, and, we haven't had a lot of conversations about it at some of our public works conferences, but we've made changes in how we analyze our systems. Many decades ago, the storm sewer philosophy was, well, the storm sewer is sized to handle a 2 or a 5 year storm, and the rest of it can just sit in the street. That's not an acceptable practice anymore. So we changed our storm sewer sizing philosophy 10 years ago now, where, we size the storm sewer using all of the computer modeling software that our consultants usually have available to them. We size it so that a 10-year design storm, there's no water on the street. A 25-year design storm, it's maybe in the gutter line or in the parking lane. So we're it's resulting in things that are a lot larger and more able to handle some of the changing climate conditions that we're dealing with. On top of that, we do analyze a lot of alternative practices to manage the stormwater. As we work through the design of West 9th Avenue last year, I challenged the engineering division staff to come up with a way to deal with the stormwater from the widening of that street. And, we worked with our consulting team and we evaluated numerous options to try to deal with stormwater, and at the end of the day, some of the biggest challenges with trying to deal with that in some of these alternative methods is all the other stuff that's in the right of way. There's not only do we have our water, our sewer, our storm, you've got AT&T, Spectrum, NTD, gas, electric, all of these people, there's all of this stuff that we have to try to work around. And so we do. I've challenged them to find alternative methods to deal with some of that stuff. You've seen it in some of our parking lot projects, using permeable pavement systems in several of our parking lot projects, because it's a lot easier to do because there's not as much stuff underground to fight with.
And are we also starting to hear about some of the alternatives to concrete? I know, that's been out there for several years, some of the alternative road reconstruction materials, because concrete has become more and more expensive, limited supply and workers. But are we starting to hear? or see
Not sure
any
what
of those?
other materials you're referring to.
I couldn't tell you the chemical makeup. I've just been reading little snippets about alternatives to concrete, but I don't know whether or not they're climate appropriate or not.
Yeah, I haven't really gotten into any of that. I know, many years ago, there was the debate between concrete and asphalt, and at the end of the day, life cycle cost analysis, concrete is a lot cheaper. Initial construction cost is virtually the same, and you get twice the life with a lot less necessary preventative maintenance. So, that's one of the reasons, we get questioned a lot, why concrete? Because on a life cycle cost, it is a lot cheaper than asphalt is.
Okay.
Right.
Well, we will plan on a early workshop for both 13th and the 27th. And
At 5?
yeah, we'll start at 5, come as you can. I mean, but if you have some questions,
In advance.
Send them my way. I'll filter them through everybody so that we'll be ready to answer them, if not before the meeting, at the meeting, so that then everybody can hear them. And that way you've got that. If it's thematic, if it's a more thematic question, like I want to talk to you about stormwater projects in general, the earlier you get those to us, the better, because then we can kind of give you a larger approach to it. If it's about a specific project, we can probably get the questions answered pretty easily. Thank you. Really great discussion.
Thank you.
Helps a lot. So let me show you what I read on Friday.
Oh, yeah.
It's like,